The document is dated October 31st, 1939. It is a procurement summary prepared for the Finnish Air Force Command in Helsinki, and it reads in the dry language that military bureaucracies use for all things including their own desperation as follows. Total combat-capable aircraft, 114. Of these, 36 are Fokker D.XXI fighters, single-engine, fixed undercarriage, produced in the Netherlands in a design already considered obsolescent by European standards. 17 are Bristol Bulldogs, biplanes so old that their fabric-covered wings require special attention in temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius. 24 are Bristol Blenheim light bombers, adequate for their role but without fighter escort in meaningful numbers. The remainder are a miscellany of trainers, reconnaissance types and liaison aircraft pressed into combat roles because there is nothing else. Against this force, the Soviet Air Force will deploy, on the morning of November the 30th, approximately 3,000 aircraft of modern design. The ratio is not a ratio, it is an execution order. The author of the October 31st summary, a staff officer whose name does not appear in the surviving copies, adds a single handwritten note in the margin of the final page. The note says, "It will have to be enough. It was not enough, and it was." Both things are true, and the story of how they can both be true is the story of the Finnish Air Force in the Winter War, one of the most asymmetric air campaigns in the history of aerial warfare, fought in darkness and cold and impossible odds, by pilots in outdated machines who somehow managed to make the arithmetic come out differently than anyone had predicted. This is not a story about heroism in the conventional documentary sense, though heroism is present. It is a story about institutions, about what a small nation does with inadequate tools when it has spent 20 years preparing to use them, and about what a large nation does with excellent tools when its institutional brain has been extracted and destroyed by its own government. It is a story about what happens when two air forces meet over the frozen forests of Finland and one of them knows exactly where it is and the other does not. The Finnish Air Force, the Suomen Ilmavoimat, enters the Winter War as the aerial arm of a nation that has been independent for barely 22 years and that has built its military from very nearly nothing. Finland gained independence from Russia in 1917, fought a brief but savage civil war in 1918, and spent the 2 decades that followed constructing a national defense from limited resources, competing strategic priorities, and the particular kind of institutional determination that characterizes small nations that have recently fought for their existence and have no illusions about what losing means. The Ilmavoimat is formed in 1918 with donated and captured aircraft, German machines, Russian machines, whatever can be made airworthy, and spends the interwar years acquiring aircraft wherever it can afford them, which means acquiring whatever is available at prices Finland can pay rather than what doctrine or tactical logic might prefer. By 1939, its inventory reflects this procurement reality with painful clarity. To understand why the October 31st summary matters beyond its immediate content, it is necessary to understand the political and economic context in which the Ilmavoimat has been trying to build itself through the interwar period. The Finnish parliament through the 1920s and into the 1930s is controlled for significant periods by parties skeptical of military expenditure, operating in a country that is genuinely poor by Western European standards and that faces real competing demands in healthcare, education and rural infrastructure that are not frivolous considerations. Defense budgets are approved, reduced in committee, debated in the press, and approved again in amounts that allow the Ilmavoimat to function and train and maintain what it has but do not allow it to modernize at the pace that European air power development in the 1930s demands. The fundamental problem is the tempo of technological change in military aviation between 1930 and 1939. A fighter design that represents the state of the art in 1934, when Finland is evaluating what to license produce domestically, is 2 generations behind the leading edge by 1939 because German and British and Soviet engineers are developing new designs every 18 months and each generation substantially outperforms the last. The Fokker D.XXI, selected in the mid-1930s as the most capable aircraft Finland can afford to license produce at the Valtion lentokonetehdas factory, is already a compromise at the moment of its selection. Chosen not because it is the best available in Europe, but because it is the best available at a unit price and a license fee that the Finnish defense budget can sustain. In a design simple enough that Finnish factory workers learning military aircraft production can build it without the tooling and expertise that more sophisticated types require. The officers of the Ilmavoimat who make these decisions are not fools, and they are not satisfied with the compromise. They know what they are accepting. The October 31st summary is the document that shows exactly what 15 years of constrained realism has produced. 114 aircraft with which to face 3,000. The Fokker D.XXI is the backbone of the fighter force, a design that the Dutch manufacturer developed in the early 1930s for export markets that could not afford the latest technology. It is sturdy, maneuverable at low and medium altitudes, and straightforward to maintain in field conditions. Its 825 horsepower Bristol Mercury engine starts reliably in cold weather, a specification requirement the Finnish Procurement Office had insisted upon for reasons that the Dutch engineers understood intellectually but had never tested in Finnish conditions. It is also underpowered by the standards of 1939, slower than most of its likely opponents, and fitted with fixed rather than retractable undercarriage, a detail that costs measurable airspeed and that marks the aircraft immediately as a machine of an earlier generation. Finland licenses the D.XXI for domestic production at the Valtion lentokonetehdas state factory and builds 36 of them between 1938 and 1939. It is the best fighter Finland has. It is not, by any honest assessment of the European air balance in 1939, a first-line machine. The Hawker Hurricane entering service with the Royal Air Force in those same years is faster by 60 km per hour. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 is faster still. The Polikarpov IBA-16, which will be the D.XXI's primary opponent over Finland, is faster in level flight and in the dive. The Bristol Bulldog, which makes up the next largest component of Finland's fighter inventory, is a fabric-covered biplane from 1927. These are the facts the October 31st summary records in its careful bureaucratic columns, and they are not facts that leave much room for optimism about what November 30th will bring. The Fokker D.XXI pilots who will fly against the Soviet Air Force are aware of all of this. They are not deluded about what they have been given. They have studied the published performance figures for Soviet types. They know the I-16 is faster in a dive. They know the newer Soviet types entering service, the MiG-1, the Ilmavoimat, already appearing in small numbers, represent a technological generation beyond anything Finland possesses. They know the numerical odds are of a kind that tactical skill can mitigate but not neutralize. What they have that the Soviet pilots facing them do not have, and that the Ilmavoimat leadership has understood and systematically cultivated in the years before the war, is something that does not appear in procurement summaries or aircraft performance tables. They have an understanding of the specific air environment over Finland in winter, the light conditions, the cloud formations, the specific ways that visibility degrades over a landscape that is uniformly white and featureless from altitude, the terrain references that allow navigation when instruments fail or landmarks disappear in snowfall, the way sound and radar bounce differently over frozen lakes than over open ground, that their opponents must learn from scratch under combat conditions with full penalties for every mistake. The conditions in which Finnish pilots fly during the Winter War are worth describing in physical terms because they define what the pilots are managing beyond the tactical problem of the engagement itself. The cockpit of a Fokker D.XXI in Finnish winter has a temperature that varies depending on altitude and the effectiveness of the engine heat ducted to the pilot's position, between -15 and -30 degrees Celsius. At those temperatures, the oil in the instrument mechanisms slows to a viscosity that introduces lag into altimeter and airspeed readings. Goggles. Fog and freeze on the inside from the pilot's exhaled breath, reducing forward visibility at critical moments. Oxygen mask seals, designed for temperate conditions, lose their pliability and leak. The stick and rudder pedals respond normally. Cold does not affect the aircraft's control surfaces directly, but the pilot's hands, even in heated gloves, lose fine motor sensitivity after extended flight at altitude, introducing small errors in control inputs that compound over the course of a sortie. Finnish pilots train in these conditions. They know what their instruments are doing at altitude in January, and they know how to compensate. They know that the particular quality of winter light in Finland, flat, directionless, shadowless in the overcast that covers the operational area for weeks at a time, makes depth perception unreliable at ranges beyond 300 meters, which is one of the reasons that Finnish fighter doctrine trains for close-range gunnery. They know that Soviet pilots, trained in the relatively milder winters of the Russian interior, will be encountering these conditions for the first time over combat targets, with no margin for the mistakes that unfamiliarity produces. The man who more than any other single figure shapes the Ilmavoimat's response to the crisis of the Winter War is Jarl Fritiof Lundqvist, the commander of the Finnish Air Force from 1930 to 1945. Lundqvist is 51 years old when the war begins, born in 1888, a career officer who has spent 15 years building an air arm from almost nothing, fighting annual budget battles with a government that understands the need for an army and a navy and regards the Air Force as something between a luxury and an experiment. He is not a theorist, he publishes no doctrine and leaves no intellectual legacy in the conventional sense. He is an administrator and a realist, the kind of commander who reads a procurement summary that ends with, "It will have to be enough," and responds not with complaint or denial, but with the question of what, precisely, it can accomplish. When the Soviet invasion begins on November 30th, 1939, Lundqvist's response to the strategic situation is not to attempt to match the Soviet Air Force on its own terms, which is impossible, but to identify with precision what the Ilmavoimat can realistically accomplish and concentrate every available resource on accomplishing exactly that. The framework Lundqvist works from is a form of strategic triage. The Finnish Air Force cannot achieve air superiority over Finland. The Soviet Air Force has 3,000 aircraft and Finland has 114. The arithmetic of air superiority requires a ratio more favorable than 26 to 1. What the Ilmavoimat can do is contest air superiority over specific sectors at specific times. Deny the Soviets the unrestricted freedom of the Finnish sky that their numerical advantage would theoretically provide, impose a cost on every penetration, make the Soviet Air Force earn every bomb it drops and every reconnaissance mission it completes. It cannot prevent Soviet bombing of Finnish cities and infrastructure, but it can make Soviet bombing costly enough that the attrition on Soviet bomber formations becomes operationally significant. Costly enough that Soviet commanders are forced to change their tactics, fly at different altitudes, provide more escort, accept lower bombing accuracy. And it can protect Finnish ground forces from Soviet close air support with sufficient effectiveness to allow those ground forces to function as a coherent defensive force. These are the objectives Lundqvist sets. They are limited and they are realistic, and they are the objectives against which the Ilmavoimat's performance in the Winter War must be measured rather than against the impossible standard of air superiority that no honest assessment of Finland's resources could have promised. The first contact between Finnish and Soviet aircraft on November 30th, 1939, occurs within hours of the border crossing on the ground, in the grey light of a Finnish December morning that offers perhaps 4 hours of usable daylight before the dark returns. Soviet SB-2 bombers. Twin-engine machines that the Soviet Air Force considers modern and capable, with a top speed that exceeds that of many contemporary fighters, appear over Finnish towns without fighter escort. The absence of escort reflects a command assumption that is so widespread in the Soviet planning for the Finnish campaign that it functions as doctrine. Finnish air defense will be negligible. The Fokker D.XXIs of the 4th Flight, based at Imola on the Karelian Isthmus, are scrambled against the first formations. The engagement that follows is a collision between Soviet confidence and Finnish preparation. The SB-2 is faster than the D.XXI in level flight at altitude, a fact that Soviet planners have noted and found reassuring. What Soviet planners have not adequately accounted for is that the D.XXI pilots are not attempting to chase bombers at altitude in level flight. They are using the terrain, the overcast, and their own intimate familiarity with the airspace to position themselves above and behind the Soviet formations, diving to attack from a vector where the SB-2's speed advantage is cancelled by the physics of the approach. The first Finnish aerial victories of the Winter War are scored before noon on November 30th, and they establish immediately that the kill-to-loss ratio the Soviet Air Force expected, the ratio implicit in an assumption of negligible air defense, is not the ratio that is actually going to obtain over Finland. The pilot who most completely embodies the Ilmavoimat's tactical approach in the Winter War's early weeks is Jorma Sarvanto, a 29-year-old lieutenant from Hämeenlinna assigned to Lentoleva 24, the fighter squadron based at Imola that will become the highest-scoring Finnish unit of the conflict. Sarvanto is not a prodigy or a natural genius in the romantic aviation sense. He is a carefully trained professional who has spent years developing the specific skills that the Ilmavoimat's tactics require. Gunnery at deflection angles, the management of energy in a diving attack where a single firing pass must be decisive because the opportunity for a second pass may not exist. The conservation of ammunition in a target-rich environment where the temptation to spray and pray must be suppressed in favor of precise, short bursts at ranges close enough to guarantee effect. He has practiced these things in the specific airspace of the Karelian Isthmus against simulated targets that use the same terrain, the same weather, the same light conditions that the actual war will present. He is, in other words, exactly the kind of pilot that Lundqvist's 15 years of institutional building has been trying to produce. On January 6, 1940, flying a Fokker D.XXI, a Castoff machine by the reckoning of every European Air Force that had evaluated the type, over the Karelian Isthmus near Uusikirkko, Sarvanto intercepts a formation of 7 Soviet DB-3 twin-engine bombers flying in close formation at medium altitude, heading west without fighter escort. The Soviet formation has the composed, orderly look of an operation whose commanders expect no serious opposition. The pilots apparently do not see the single Finnish fighter positioning above and behind them, managing his energy in the dive, waiting for the angle to open correctly. When Sarvanto opens fire, he is very close. Finnish fighter doctrine specifically trains for close-range gunnery, on the principle that every round fired at long range is a round wasted, and that the D.XXI's limited ammunition load requires that every burst must count. What follows is documented in Sarvanto's own combat report, the Soviet loss records cross-referenced after 1991, and the accounts of Finnish ground observers who watched the engagement from below. In approximately 10 minutes of repeated diving attacks, Sarvanto shoots down 6 of the 7 bombers. The 7th escapes. No other Finnish aircraft participates in the engagement. Sarvanto returns to base, files a combat report in the precise, technical language that Finnish Air Force reporting style requires, notes the ammunition expended and the results observed, and requests permission to resume his patrol. 6 bombers in 10 minutes. The claim, when it circulates through the Finnish press and reaches the international wire services, is received with skepticism in military analysis circles in Germany, Britain, and the United States. The numbers seem implausible for a single pilot in a single engagement flying a machine that the evaluators have categorized as second-rate. The numbers are confirmed by aircraft wreckage surveys on the ground, by Finnish military record-keeping that proves in the decades after the war to be among the most scrupulously accurate of any belligerent in the conflict, and by Soviet records that, when they become accessible after 1991, show the losses exactly where Sarvanto's report places them. His engagement on January 6th is not a fluke, and it is not an anomaly. It is an extreme example, extreme in outcome if not in method, of a pattern that repeats itself across the Finnish front throughout the Winter War. Soviet bombers. In formations without adequate fighter escort against Finnish pilots who have trained specifically for the tactics that make those bombers vulnerable, in weather and light conditions that the Finns understand and the Soviets are learning under fire. Sarvanto is not the only Finnish pilot accumulating kills at rates that seem impossible against the stated performance specifications of their aircraft. Aino Luukkonen, who will end the Winter War with 9 aerial victories before going on to become one of Finland's leading aces of the continuation war, is flying the same D.XXI out of the same sector and achieving results that follow the same pattern. Disciplined positioning, close-range gunnery, quick disengagement before Soviet fighters can respond. Oiva Tuominen, flying from Uti, adds to his score in engagements that validate the same tactical principles. The consistency of the method across multiple pilots in multiple squadrons operating in different sectors is not coincidence. It is the product of a common doctrine, commonly trained, applied consistently by pilots who understand both the capabilities of their aircraft and the vulnerabilities of their opponents. The Soviet Air Force that the Ilmavoimat is fighting in the winter of 1939 and 1940 is an institution in a specific kind of crisis that has nothing to do with its aircraft or with the courage of its pilots, and everything to do with what has been done to its senior leadership by the state it serves. Stalin's purge of the Red Army Officer Corps, executed in waves between 1937 and 1938, removed from the Soviet military approximately 35,000 officers at every level of command. The figures are staggering and specific. 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders, 154 of 186 divisional commanders. In the Soviet Air Force specifically, the purge targets the experienced commanders who have flown in the Spanish Civil War and the battles against Japan at Khalkhin Gol. The men who have actual combat experience and who would be the most capable of translating that experience into realistic training and effective doctrine. What replaces them in the compressed timeline between the purge and the Finnish War are officers promoted faster than their experience warrants, into roles more complex than their training has prepared them for, executing doctrines they do not fully understand under conditions they have not anticipated. The Soviet pilots over Finland in December 1939 are not, by and large, incompetent. They are young. They are flying aircraft that are technically superior to their Finnish opponents in several measurable categories, and they are brave in the specific way that young men in dangerous situations learn quickly to be brave. But they are being commanded at squadron and group level by officers who have been in those roles for months rather than years, receiving orders from higher commanders who have reached their positions through the elimination of everyone above them, rather than through the accumulation of demonstrated competence and operating in an air environment, Finnish winter, Finnish weather, Finnish terrain, for which their training has provided almost no relevant preparation. The Soviet command recognizes, by late December 1939, that the air campaign is not proceeding as planned. The recognition produces a response that is, given the institutional constraints of the Soviet military system, about as fast and as serious as could be expected. Stalin replaces the commander of the Leningrad military district, General Kirill Meretskov, with Marshal Semyon Timoshenko in January 1940, triggering a comprehensive review of tactics and procedures across all arms, including aviation. In the Soviet Air Force, the response to the Finnish campaign includes new directives on bomber escort, revised formation tactics, intended to make bombing runs less predictable for defending fighters, and increased attention to the navigation training that has been producing the airspace violations over Sweden and the missed targets over Finland. Some of these changes take effect before the war ends. Soviet bomber formations in February and March 1940 show measurably better escort discipline than the formations of November and December. Navigation accuracy over the Karelian front improves as crews accumulate experience in the specific airspace. The Soviet Air Force of March 1940 is a somewhat more effective instrument than the Soviet Air Force of November 1939, and the improvement costs the Ilmavoimat more in the campaign's final weeks than in its first. But the fundamental structural problem, the absence of the experienced leadership cadre that the purge destroyed, cannot be corrected in 3 months. The knowledge that the purge removed took decades to accumulate. It will take years to replace, and Finland does not give the Soviet Air Force years. The war lasts 105 days. Soviet Air Force training in 1939 emphasizes formation flying, parade ground precision, and the execution of pre-planned missions against known targets. It does not adequately emphasize the navigation skills required to find targets over a featureless winter landscape, the instrument flying skills required when Finnish weather closes in and visual references disappear, or the tactical flexibility required when the defensive situation encountered does not match the defensive situation anticipated in the briefing room. The tactical consequences of this institutional fragility are visible and consistent throughout the Winter War. Soviet bomber formations fly at altitudes and in close formations optimized for the exercises they have been trained in, not for combat against a defending fighter force that will attack from above and behind, precisely because the formations make that approach obvious. Fighter escort is provided inconsistently, sometimes absent entirely from missions where it should be mandatory, reflecting failures of coordination between bomber and fighter units that experienced commanders would have corrected, but that the purge's replacements have not yet learned to anticipate. Navigation errors send Soviet aircraft into Swedish airspace on multiple documented occasions, causing diplomatic incidents and, more significantly, revealing the extent to which Soviet crews are unable to orient themselves reliably over a winter landscape that offers few visual landmarks. Ground attack missions against Finnish troop concentrations show a persistent failure to locate actual targets, partly because Finnish ground forces have learned to camouflage their positions against aerial reconnaissance with considerable skill, and partly because the winter terrain itself, uniformly white, intersected by frozen lakes and rivers that look identical from altitude, presents a navigation and target identification problem that pilots without specific preparation for it cannot reliably solve. The Ilmavoimat exploits all of these weaknesses with a consistency that, measured against the resources available to it, represents one of the most effective small-force air campaigns in the history of aerial warfare. The raw figures make the argument without requiring elaboration. Finland begins the Winter War with 114 combat aircraft. During the course of the conflict, it receives approximately 130 additional aircraft from foreign suppliers, machines purchased under emergency conditions from governments and manufacturers willing to sell to a nation under assault at prices reflecting the urgency of the transaction rather than the quality of the merchandise. From Britain come Gloucester Gladiators, biplanes that the Royal Air Force is replacing with Hurricanes and Spitfires and considers obsolescent. From Italy come Fiat G50 monoplane fighters, modern enough in design but delivered in quantities too small to constitute a squadron until late in the war. From France come Morane Saulnier MS-406s, a type that will perform poorly against German fighters over France in 1940, and that faces comparable Soviet opponents over Finland. A handful of Hawker Hurricanes arrives through various channels. None of these reinforcements represent first-line equipment. Not one of them is a machine that any of the major European air powers would have chosen to fly into combat against the frontline types of 1940 if alternatives existed. The Ilmavoimat takes them all, incorporates them as fast as its ground crews and pilot pool can absorb them, and puts them into the air. What the raw aircraft numbers do not capture is the specific role the Ilmavoimat plays in the ground battle along the Mannerheim Line. The Karelian Isthmus, where Finland's main defensive fortifications run from the Gulf of Finland to Lake Ladoga, is the sector where the Soviet army concentrates its major effort from December 1939 through February 1940. The fortifications at Suma, the most heavily contested section of the line, hold against repeated Soviet assaults through December and into January, in part because Finnish artillery and infantry are competent and determined, and in part because the Soviet assault tactics in December are badly organized, attacking frontally without adequate coordination between armor and infantry, in ways that experienced Soviet commanders would not have permitted, but that the purge's replacements have not yet learned to avoid. When Timoshenko takes command in January 1940 and restructures the Soviet assault, the threat to the Mannerheim Line becomes substantially more serious. Concentrated artillery preparation lasting days, better coordination between arms, and the systematic targeting of Finnish strongpoints with firepower concentrations that dwarf anything the Finns had faced in the war's opening weeks. It is in this phase, January and February 1940, that the Ilmavoimat's contribution to the ground battle becomes most directly visible. Finnish aircraft fly ground attack missions against Soviet artillery concentrations and logistics columns on the roads behind the Soviet front. Missions that do not produce the kill scores of the aerial interception engagements, but that impose real delay and disruption on the Soviet operational rhythm at moments when delay is worth more than any fighter-kill ratio. Finnish reconnaissance aircraft, flying in conditions that keep Soviet reconnaissance largely grounded, provide Finnish artillery and infantry commanders with targeting information that compensates partially for Finland's severe disadvantage in raw firepower. The Ilmavoimat is not large enough to change the arithmetic of the Mannerheim Line battle, which is ultimately broken through by Soviet mass in March 1940. It is large enough to contribute meaningfully to the delay of the Soviet breakthrough, and delay is what Finnish diplomacy needs to produce a negotiated outcome rather than a surrender. Against approximately 900 Soviet aircraft lost over Finland during the Winter War, a figure derived from Soviet records made available after 1991 and considered conservative by Finnish historians who have compared it with their own documented engagement records. The Ilmavoimat loses 62 aircraft in aerial combat and a further 59 to all causes including accidents, mechanical failure and ground fire. The aggregate kill ratio is, by the standards of any aerial campaign of the Second World War, extraordinary. The precise figures remain subject to revision as additional Soviet archival material becomes accessible, and the methodology of counting losses differs between Finnish and Soviet records in ways that complicate direct comparison. But the fundamental disproportion, a force of outdated aircraft flown by pilots whose numbers never exceeded a few hundred at any point in the campaign, inflicting losses at a ratio that no analysis of their equipment would have predicted, is not a matter of serious historical dispute. The question that matters is not whether it happened, but why. The answer has several components, and the least important of them, despite what popular accounts tend to suggest, is individual heroism. Finnish pilots are genuinely skilled and, in the specific ways that the Winter War requires skill, superbly trained. But the training is the product of an institution, and the institution is the product of 15 years of deliberate building by men like Lundqvist, who understood what Finland would need and built toward it methodically. The central insight of Finnish fighter doctrine worked out in the years before the war and refined through the pre-war exercises that the Ilmavoimat conducted in conditions as close as possible to what actual winter combat would present, is that the D.XXI's weaknesses matter far less in the specific environment of Finnish winter air combat than its strengths. It is maneuverable at low and medium altitudes, where much of the actual combat over Finland takes place, because the overcast and the short operational range of ground-based targets pull engagements down from the high altitudes where Soviet bomber escort would be more effective. It is robust and simple, qualities that translate directly into maintainability in conditions where complexity is the enemy of readiness. It can operate from frozen lakes and packed snow strips, which means it can disperse to locations that Soviet reconnaissance does not find and Soviet ground attack cannot easily reach. And the pilots who fly it know the airspace they are defending with an intimacy that no amount of intelligence preparation can replicate from outside. The ground crews of the Ilmavoimat deserve more space in the history of the Winter War than they typically receive. The Finnish Air Force maintains operational readiness rates that, given the conditions and the equipment, are genuinely remarkable. Ground temperatures at Finnish airfields during the campaign regularly reach -30 and -40 degrees Celsius. Aircraft engines must be pre-warmed before starting, not as a precaution, but as an absolute requirement, because an engine that has sat in -40 cold will not turn over without preheating, regardless of how well maintained it is. Hydraulic lines freeze. Oxygen systems ice up. The fabric covering the control surfaces of older types like the Bulldog and the Gladiator accumulates ice during flight that must be carefully removed before the next sortie. The rubber seals on fuel and hydraulic fittings contract in the cold and develop leaks that require constant monitoring. The men performing all of this maintenance work outdoors, in the dark. Finland in December offers fewer than 6 hours of usable daylight south of Helsinki and considerably less further north, with limited shelter, improvised tools, and the additional urgency of knowing that a D.XXI sitting unserviceable on the snow is an hour the pilots above Finland fly without relief. Finnish ground crew serviceability rates through the Winter War consistently exceed 80%. The Ilmavoimat keeps its aircraft in the air not because maintaining them is easy, but because the men responsible for maintaining them understand that the alternative is not an option. The aircraft that Finland acquires from foreign suppliers during the Winter War tell their own story about the international response to a conflict that the world expected to end in Finnish defeat within days. The diplomatic effort required to obtain even the inadequate machines that arrive is itself a measure of the international situation. Sweden, Finland's nearest neighbour and the most natural source of military assistance, is under intense Soviet and German pressure not to intervene openly. It provides volunteer personnel and allows some private sales, but limits direct state-to-state military transfers out of fear of Soviet reaction. Britain provides Gladiators, but faces its own rearmament program and cannot spare frontline types without compromising its own readiness. France provides MS-406s and some additional machines, while simultaneously preparing its own forces for the German attack that will come in May 1940. Italy sells G-50s under a commercial arrangement that Mussolini approves, partly out of ideological sympathy with Finland's resistance to Soviet expansion, and partly because the transaction is commercially attractive. The United States provides nothing officially, the Neutrality Acts constraining the Roosevelt administration, though American manufacturers find ways to move some equipment through indirect channels that the administration chooses not to examine too closely. The Gloucester Gladiators from Britain arrive in wooden crates, disassembled, and must be assembled and test-flown by Finnish mechanics who have never seen the type before, working from English-language technical manuals in unheated hangars in January. The Fiat G50s from Italy arrive with Italian technical documentation that no one in the Ilmavoimat's ground crew establishment can read, requiring improvised translation through Finnish officers who know some Italian and a great deal of creative inference about which connector goes where. The MS-406s from France arrive without spare parts in adequate quantities and with airframe handling characteristics different enough from Finnish types that pilots transitioning to the type do so on a compressed schedule that peacetime safety standards would not permit. By some accounts, Finnish pilots fly their first combat sorties in the MS-406, having accumulated fewer than 10 hours on type. The aircraft proves serviceable enough in Finnish hands, achieving results against Soviet opponents that it will not achieve against German fighters over France a few months later. A disparity that has less to do with the aircraft than with the quality of the opponent and the tactical conditions in which it is operating. The international military observers who watch the Winter War draw their own conclusions from the Ilmavoimat's performance. German Luftwaffe officers assigned to observe the Finnish campaign note the D.XXI's effectiveness with professional respect and analytical interest. The Finnish results are not what the published performance specifications of the aircraft would lead a competent analyst to predict, and the gap between predicted and actual performance points toward variables that German analysts begin cataloguing. The quality of Finnish pilot training, the specific tactical doctrine the Ilmavoimat employs, the institutional capacity to maintain aircraft at high readiness in extreme conditions. What the German observers take back to the Luftwaffe is confirmation of conclusions they have been developing from other sources. That training quality and tactical doctrine matter more than raw performance specifications in determining combat outcomes, and that an Air Force's institutional culture is as important a variable as its equipment. The Germans have already concluded this from Spain. The Winter War provides additional evidence. What Germany does not conclude from the Finnish example, what the German military analytical establishment declines to factor into its planning for the Eastern Front in 1941, is that the same logic applies to its own position as the invader in unfamiliar terrain against a defender who knows exactly where it is. The lesson is legible in the Finnish evidence. Germany does not read it. The Soviet bombing campaign against Finnish cities and rear areas during the Winter War deserves examination as a case study in the gap between strategic air power theory and strategic air power practice. Helsinki is bombed on November 30th, 1939, the first morning of the war, in an attack that kills 97 civilians, damages buildings across multiple city blocks, and generates international outrage sufficient to produce the Soviet Union's expulsion from the League of Nations. A diplomatic embarrassment that the Soviet government accepts as the price of the campaign. What the bombing does not produce is the rapid civilian demoralization that Soviet air power theory in this period anticipates. The Finnish civil defense system, developed and practiced systematically in the years before the war, absorbs the attacks with a competence that reduces their psychological impact far below what their physical damage might imply. Shelters function. Warning systems work. Evacuation procedures, practiced in the anticipation of exactly this scenario, execute. The Finnish population responds to the bombing of its capital, not with the collapse of morale that Soviet planners have written into their campaign assumptions, but with a hardening of the national consensus that the war must be fought. And the Ilmavoimat's contribution, the interception of Soviet bomber formations at rates high enough that Soviet commanders are forced to change their tactics, fly higher, fly faster, provide more escort at the cost of reduced bomb loads, further degrades whatever bombing accuracy the formations might otherwise have achieved. The Soviet Air Force is not driven from Finnish skies, but every kilometer it flies over Finland costs it something, and the cost accumulates across 105 days into a total that the Soviet command had not budgeted for. The Ilmavoimat's contribution to the campaign is not confined to the Karelian Isthmus, where most of the dramatic fighter engagements and the highest profile kills occur. In the Northern Theatre, the forests around Suomussalmi, where the Soviet 44th Division is encircled and destroyed in December and January, the Finnish Air Force provides the only form of reconnaissance that can reliably penetrate the weather and terrain conditions of the Finnish interior in winter. The Bristol Blenheim light bombers of Lentolaivu 44, operating from bases in central Finland, fly harassment missions against the Soviet columns on the Rate Road that contribute to the isolation of the encircled Soviet force. These are not glamorous operations. The Blenheim crews fly at low altitude in conditions of poor visibility against a target that is scattered through forest and not easily distinguished from the air, absorbing ground fire from Soviet troops who have no air defense weapons but who shoot at anything that flies over them with whatever they have. The Blenheim is not built for low-altitude attack, and the crews know it. They fly anyway because the maps showing the Soviet positions on the Rate Road are the most valuable intelligence the Finnish Army's Suomussalmi command has, and the only way to update those maps in the rapid fluid conditions of a December encirclement is to fly over the road and look. The pilots of Lentolaivu 44 receive less attention in the history of the Winter War than the fighter aces of Lentolaivu 24. This disparity reflects a bias in how air war history is written, toward the individual kill, the scored victory, the ace's record, and away from the grinding institutional work of reconnaissance and attack flying that supports the ground battle without producing the statistics that fit into a headline. The Finnish Air Force that performs this work is not the Finnish Air Force of romanticized memory. It is a small, cold, underfunded institution doing everything it can with what it has, in conditions that make every sortie a minor feat of maintenance, and every return to base a consequence of preparation as much as luck. The October 31st summary does not have a line for this. It counts aircraft. It does not count what the men flying them know or what the ground crews maintaining them are willing to do in the dark and the cold to keep them in the air. The Moscow Peace Treaty of March 13, 1940, ends the Winter War on terms that are painful for Finland, but survivable. Finland cedes the Karelian Isthmus, Vyborg, a strip of territory along the northern shore of Lake Ladoga, and the Hanko Peninsula to the Soviet Union, approximately 11% of its pre-war territory and 12% of its population, who are evacuated in a movement of 430,000 people completed in under 2 weeks rather than left under Soviet governance. Finland retains its independence. The Soviet Union, which entered the war expecting to occupy Finland entirely in 12 days, accepts a negotiated settlement after 105. The gap between those two outcomes is filled, incompletely but meaningfully, by Finnish soldiers in the forests, by Finnish artillerymen on the Mannerheim Line, and by Finnish pilots in outdated aircraft who made the cost of the campaign higher than Stalin had budgeted for. The Ilmavoimat, which began the war with 114 aircraft, ends it with approximately 130 operational machines. The net gain disguises the true institutional achievement. Finland has sustained a 3.5-month air campaign against a force that outnumbered it more than 25-1 in aircraft, absorbed significant combat losses, replaced those losses from foreign sources under the most adverse procurement conditions imaginable, and emerged with its organizational structure intact and its experienced pilot pool, those who survived, carrying knowledge that no training syllabus can convey and no peacetime exercise can replicate. The institutional legacy of the Winter War air campaign becomes fully visible when the continuation war begins in June 1941, and Finland re-enters the conflict against the Soviet Union alongside Germany. The Ilmavoimat that takes the field in 1941 has acquired, in the 14 months between the peace and the new outbreak, more modern aircraft, Brewster Buffaloes purchased from the United States, Curtiss Hawk 75s, and eventually German types, including the Messerschmitt Bf 109, and has combined this improved equipment with the experienced pilot pool forged in the Winter War. The Brewster Buffalo is the case that aviation historians return to repeatedly, because it illustrates the institution question with the clarity of a controlled experiment. The Buffalo has been evaluated by the United States Navy and found inadequate for frontline service against the Japanese aircraft it is likely to face. It has been sold to Britain, the Netherlands, East Indies, and Belgium, and in each of these deployments it performs poorly against German and Japanese opponents, recording kill ratios that confirm the Navy's assessment that it cannot compete with the best contemporary fighters. In Finnish hands against Soviet opponents over the Karelian Front in 1941, the Brewster Buffalo achieves a kill ratio of approximately 32-1. 32 Soviet aircraft for every Finnish Buffalo lost. The figure is documented, cross-referenced against Soviet records, and accepted by air historians who have examined it carefully. The Finnish aces who achieve the highest individual scores of the continuation war are, almost without exception, men whose careers begin in the Winter War D.XXI cockpit. Ilmari Juutilainen, who ends the war as the highest-scoring Finnish pilot, with 94 confirmed aerial victories, flies the Buffalo and later the Bf-109, but begins his career against Soviet aircraft in the Winter War. Aino Luukkonen, who ends with 56 victories, makes his first kills in the Winter War and brings that tactical foundation into the continuation war's faster and more capable machines. Hans Wind, 59 victories, has Winter War experience. The pattern holds consistently. The pilots who achieved the most in the continuation war are the ones whose training began before 1940, in the specific environment of Finnish winter air combat, against the Soviet opponent in the specific institutional state in which the purge had left it. The Winter War did not just produce a kill ratio, it produced a generation of professionals. There is something in the October 31st summary, the procurement document, the columns of inadequate numbers, the handwritten marginal note, that rewards attention beyond its immediate content. The note "it will have to be enough" is not optimism, and it is not despair. It is the statement of a professional who has looked at what exists and made a decision about what to do with it, which is to say, the only decision available. The Ilmavoimat in 1939 cannot wish itself better aircraft. It cannot wait for the world to recognize Finland's need and supply it with Hurricanes and Spitfires. It has what it has, and it has 15 years of institutional preparation for the specific task of fighting with what it has. The Winter War air campaign stands as one of the clearest historical arguments against the proposition that military outcomes are primarily determined by equipment. Equipment matters. A force flying aircraft substantially inferior to its opponents in every performance category faces a structural disadvantage that institutional quality can mitigate but cannot fully eliminate. Finland's air campaign does not disprove this. Finland loses the Winter War in the sense that it cedes 11% of its territory at the Moscow Peace Treaty, and its pilots die in numbers that leave gaps in the Ilmavoimat's experienced cadre that take years to fill. The institutional quality of the Finnish Air Force does not make the war costless. What it does is make the war survivable at a cost in aircraft and pilots and national resources that Finland can bear, when a less prepared institution flying the same aircraft would have been destroyed in the first month. The difference between surviving a 105-day campaign against a force that outnumbers you 25-1 in aircraft and being destroyed by it is not a difference in equipment. It is a difference in everything else. What it does with it is documented in the combat reports, the wreckage surveys, the Soviet archival records, and the performance of a generation of pilots in the continuation war. The Fokker D.XXI, fixed undercarriage and all, turns out to be a weapon, not because of what it is, but because of who is flying it, trained in what doctrine, in what environment, against an opponent who underestimates every variable that the October 31st summary does not capture in its columns of aircraft counts and performance specifications. It will have to be enough. It was. So, which matters more in the end? The quality of what you fly or the quality of the institution behind the cockpit? Leave your answer below and watch this next video.